And I see there are a lot of others too, David Newton. I originally served in Yemen beginning in 30 years ago in 1983 when I was the Deputy Chief of Mission. And I remember one of the first things I did is I wrote an appraisal of Ali Abdullah Saleh after 5 years and offered the, I suppose, at that time, seemingly hazardous prediction that he might be around for another 5. So today we are here to talk about Yemen's future, and we're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Charles Schmitz with us. 2 years after the start of the anti-government protests in Yemen, the country remains torn by political divisions and rivalries. Needless to say, this is not a new circumstance, as the Yemen hands here know. I have frequently, Yemen has been sometimes described as a failed state, but not a failed society. This issue of reconciliation is a perennial one. Dr. Schmitz will examine the political challenges ahead and whether or not the country's upcoming national dialogue holds the key to stabilizing Yemen. Who are the domestic and foreign actors vying to shape Yemen's future? And can the national dialogue successfully incorporate the political aspirations of a sufficient number of competing Yemeni groups to lead to a stable political settlement? Anyway, Dr. Schultz, we welcome you. Excuse me, Dr. Schmitz, we welcome you very much.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Institute for having me down here. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to this audience. I found that in my years of working on Yemen and talking in Washington that the standards have gone up. And so this is a conversation. I don't expect that I know more than you guys out here. So the question is, will the dialogue succeed? And the answer is, I don't know. Shall I go home? It really is going to have successes and it's going to have failures. And the question really is, can it create the legitimate foundation for governance and political stability in Yemen? And let me just say right now that that may not mean a strong centralized state nor one state. It depends upon the decisions and actions of domestic and foreign participants. And I think the Yemeni experience in the Arab Spring, it really shows us that, that political agency is very important in shaping events. Too often we fall into determinisms, either economic or political. We look to broad structures and trends and we say they can't change. But I think the lesson here that we've seen is that political action, political agency does change things. And it's really Yemeni political agency and foreign political agency that will shape what happens and the success or not of the national dialogue. Okay, first to just foreshadow, I see the key conflicts. The United States, among the foreigners, the United States and the Saudis are interested in security. Primarily and almost exclusively. The Iranians are interested in causing problems for the Saudis. Those are the key foreign actors in Yemen right now. Then inside of Yemen, there are the two groups who broke the rules of the game, the Houthis and the Southerners. They were the ones that broke out of Saleh's system and brought it down. Then there's the accommodation between the old elites of both sides. That's the Saleh and the Islahi elites, who were the regime, and the revolutionaries inside of Yemen, who have quite different expectations. Those are the youth. And the key question is, can effective institutions of governance be created? Widely defined, and I want us to stay away, because I think sometimes the problem of the failed state is our problem to recognize that the national state may not be the institution that needs to be built. That you need to have effective governance that we can manage the economy, security, and that it can finance itself. I think in order to understand the national dialogue, which is set to begin March 18th, on the second anniversary of the massacre that really split the elite in Yemen and brought the regime to its end, we have to back up a little bit. And for those of us who are not up on Yemen, this will help. But I think there's some key characteristics of what happened in Yemen, the way that the regime fell in Yemen, that are important for understanding what's going on with the national dialogue, the prospects for the national dialogue. Okay. The first, as I said, is that beginning in 2004, the Houthis in the north began a rebellion that very much was not planned. It was very much a war that went through 6 iterations between 2004 and 2010, in which the Yemeni forces, Saudi forces, and the Houthi forces fought against each other. And that conflict took its own dynamic. So what began as perhaps a protest and a revolt and some personal issues ended up becoming a full-fledged armed insurgency that basically won. And so the Houthis now control a large section of the north. Then the Southerners basically did the same thing. They broke the rules, but they did it foreshadowing the Arab Spring by peaceful means. They had civil disobedience, and it was civil disobedience that proved very effective at undermining the Ali Abdullah Saleh's rule in the south. So 2 areas that both lost wars, the Houthis, or the area of the Houthis, Sadal, were the royalists in the Yemeni civil war in the north in the 60s. They lost that war. And in the south in 1994, the losers of the war. So both areas were losers of war and were not reincorporated into Ali Abdullah Saleh's system and eventually broke out. Then within the regime, there's Ali Abdullah Saleh's famous patronage networks, his mode of governance. His mode of governance was one of de-institutionalizing. He destabilized institutions by ruling personally. The criticism that came from the South, I remember when they were unifying, they called it the telephone method of ruling. He would personally call on the phone individuals and make decisions and govern that way, such that institutions had no stability and had no power. And that became generalized. It's the way that the General People's Congress, the ruling party, worked. It's the way that institutions worked as well. They were large political patronage networks, where the key variable was your allegiance to the regime. That was the key variable, whether you got a position or not, or whether you were in it or not. And then after the war in 1994. Ali Abdullah Saleh decided that rather than ruling in coalition governments, he was going to pull out and begin to rule with his party alone. And he pushed the Islahi party away, which was his Islamic, it's an Islamic tribal alliance that had been his ally against the communists in the south for a long time. After the war in 1994, he pulled away from them. And in doing so, the Islah Party eventually in the late 90s began to build common ground with the Yemeni Ishtiraki, the Yemeni Socialist Party. So here we have the Islamists and the Socialists getting together on the basis of the common position of opposition to Ali Abdullah Saleh, and that worked. Many people thought it was impossible, but in Yemen it worked, and that was another important precedent to the coming fall of Ali Abdullah Saleh. And then the 2 final points, the question of succession, the presidency. Ali Abdullah Saleh was grooming his son, Ali, to become, Ahmed Ali, to become president, and this split the elite. The critical thing, people, Yemenis in general were unhappy about this. His son was not considered to be a qualified leader. And people didn't like the idea of it anyway. In a republic, you have basically a government of inheritance, and so people didn't like this in general. But the key thing is it split the elite. And Ali Muqsin, who was the key military leader and right-hand man and the face of repression in Yemen for 30 years under Ali Abdullah Saleh, didn't like this. And a lot of the reason for the success, actually, of the Houthis in the north was infighting within the military between the president's son and Ali Muqsin's forces. And then the last point is the rejuvenation of Al-Qaeda. In 2009, the Saudis had successfully run Al-Qaeda out of Saudi Arabia. They went to Yemen, and they joined up forces, and they announced the formation of Al-Qaeda, and they they became the first al-Qaeda group to actually carry out attacks on the U.S. homeland. And this, of course, got the attention of everybody. They were not going to be a local group. They were going to be a focal point. Analysts at this point had decided that al-Qaeda in Pakistan was on the end, was on the run, and that there was great fear that al-Qaeda was going to congregate again in Yemen, just when Yemen seemed to be having troubles. And this is where the discourse of failed state comes up. A lot of the discourse of failed state is simply that the Yemeni state is not able to contain al-Qaeda, which is a threat to the Saudis and the threat to the United States. Okay, then the rebellion happened. And, you know, nobody saw the rebellion coming. There's a lot of sort of retrospective thinking. You know, why didn't the academy see the rebellion coming? You can't predict the future. People make the future. And that's what happened here. The events in Tunisia were so stunning that it was like lightning that shot across all of the Middle East. Of course, you know, the Middle East was ripe for it. It's true. But you needed to have the spark, and you needed to have the sustained organization afterwards to be able for it to work. And in Yemen, what happened after Tunisia, and particularly after Egypt was the key one, because Egypt is a key U.S. ally, as Yemen is. The U.S. government has a very close relationship, a military relationship with Yemen. And so the Yemenis were watching very closely what happened in Cairo, because Cairo also is a key U.S. military ally, and they wondered whether Obama would let Mubarak fall. And when he did, that's when Yemen really lit up. And the protesters went into the street, and Ali Abdullah Saleh, a few days after Mubarak fell, Ali Abdullah Saleh went before Parliament, and he said, there will be early elections. Elections had been postponed. They were supposed to be in 2009, but both parties, the opposition and the present party, had agreed to postpone. And they said there will be early elections. I will not be a candidate, and my son will not be a candidate. And the opposition refused, because they knew now they had good cards, and they went, you know, they went for blood. They wanted him to step down immediately, and that led Yemen to a bit of a stalemate. And then the key turning point was March 18th, which is when the second anniversary of the massacre on March 18th is when the national dialogue is going to take place. What happened was some 40-something, it appears now, protesters were gunned down in the protest square by the university by somebody. It appears some form of security forces. It's interesting. Just before the massacre, I felt that Ali Abdullah Saleh had the upper hand, that he had contained the protest and he had played his normal games, and that the system was still working for him, at least within the center. I'm not talking about the Southerners or the Houthis, but he was winning. And so I often wonder, you know, who did that shooting and who ordered that shooting, because Ali Abdullah Saleh had no interest in that shooting happening, because he was winning at that point. And there was an interesting comment today, it was in the paper yesterday, by Hadi. He was talking to some people in the youth, and he said that when the bomb went off, there was a bombing of the government, including Ali Abdullah Saleh, in June, the beginning of June in 2010. 11, thank you. And he said that, Hadi said that he went to the president in his bed in this hospital room, and that's when there was a big battle going on in Hasaba between the Hashid, Sadiq al-Ahmar, and the government forces. And the president told him to stand down, to stop that war. And then he went to all the president's relatives who were in the military and said, the president says stand down, and they ignored him and kept it going. So that makes me wonder about who actually shot, because I don't think, maybe I give him too much credit, but I don't think Ali Abdullah Saleh would have done that. Okay, so that massacre split the elite, and this is one of the key things about Yemen. Ali Muqsin, you know, the face of repression in Yemen, said, "I'm going to protect the protesters." And I said, "That's the wolf guarding the sheep." I mean, if I'm a protester, I am scared. I don't want Ali Muqsin guarding me. You know, what happened here? And that made a balance of forces, of military forces, not equal. Ali Muqsin does not have the forces that the Salak clan had, but enough to make them back down. And so then there was a stalemate for a while. And the other key event that happened was Al-Qaeda, for, again, reasons unbeknownst to me, and against the advice of Osama bin Laden, they began a ground campaign to actually hold territory in the south. And there's lots of strange rumors about why, who, what, and whatnot. But as security forces, as the capital became divided between competing military camps, the units began moving back to the capital and moving away from the rural areas, and then they abandoned Abyan, and oddly, Al-Qaeda walked in and found arsenals full and picked them up. Strange. But the combination of the split of the military, the standoff in the capital, and the now ground campaign of Al-Qaeda got the attention of the foreigners. And at this point, the United States and Saudi Arabia, I think, decided that Ali Abdullah Saleh was more of a liability than an asset. And the Gulf Plan was hatched sort of in the late spring. And in the Gulf Plan, there was a transfer of power, a proposed transfer of power, where Saleh was going to turn his power over to Hadi. A transitional government was formed of half GPC, half ruling party members, and half of the opposition, the common ground, I call it, or what do we call it? The Liqa Mushtarak. It is the, what's the English? Joint Meeting Party, yes. I think common ground is a better translation, but we call it the Joint Meeting Parties, whatever that is. They got half the government, and they got the prime minister. Basando is the prime minister. He still is the prime minister. And then this transitional government is supposed to last for 2 years, and in it there's to be this national dialogue, which is now upcoming on March 18th. And the national dialogue, the Yemenis are supposed to sit down and solve all their problems. Does anybody believe that? I mean, it sounds crazy. It really does. I mean, you know, it would be like, I don't know what. We would get everybody together and we would sit them down and we would solve our problems. We'd solve our drug problems. We would solve terrorism. We would solve all this just by sitting down together at some forum. But actually, in Yemen, this is a tradition. They have gotten themselves out of other messes, political standoffs. Like, for example, the Civil War. This is the way that the Civil War in the North was resolved, by a series of conferences. So it's not so crazy, okay? The idea of sitting down and solving all your problems. One of their tasks is to write a new constitution. So to build the foundations of a post-Saleh regime. And then in 2014, if they stay on schedule, they're going to have elections under that new constitution and under that new electoral board. In that Gulf Agreement, what's notable is that the revolutionaries had no role. This was not a political settlement of a victorious street over a regime. It's not the case that the street overthrew Ali Abdullah Saleh. It's that the foreign powers saw that Yemen was headed towards civil war. They were afraid of Somalia and Al-Qaeda, and meaning Somaliization of Yemen, and then the rise of Al-Qaeda. And they stepped in and formed kind of an old elite compromise. That's what we have. And it's represented by the transitional government being half opposition, half ruling party. That's what we have right now. And that's who in power. When Ali Abdullah Saleh finally signed the thing, several times he invited the U.S. ambassador over and said he was going to sign it, and then stood there and did nothing. He was having fun for a while. He finally signed it in November of 2011. Again, I didn't give it a chance. I don't think anybody gave it a chance. You know, at that point, we were quite depressed about what was happening in Yemen. And all of a sudden, it started working. So the successes of the transitional government are basically due to the elite standing down. And they did. The elite in Yemen decided that, you know, they had pushed it too far, and that they needed to step back and recalculate and renegotiate. And the key thing was the Security Committee. It was able to disengage the troops in Sana'a. It was able to get them off the street and get them back to the barracks. It was able to open the roads again. It was able to solve a lot of the confrontations that were going on. Then things got really interesting. The new president dismissed some of the key relatives of Ali al-Saleh. There, Washington stepped in, and the Treasury said that they would freeze the assets of anybody who was seen to be obstructing the settlement. That helped. And they stood down. And then just recently, Hadi ordered the missiles out of the president's son's hands. The president's son first said no, and it looked like we might be coming to a confrontation. And then he gave up. The missiles are now in Hadi's hands. He announced a military organization where the entire security apparatus, the military and the domestic security forces, are going to be entirely reorganized on different bases. And he seems to be moving ahead. And under this renegotiation, it's assumed that there is some sort of a deal between the president's son and Ali Muqsin. They will either both retire or they will both be put in positions where they can watch each other. But it appears as if this is going to go along quite well. The revolutionaries, of course, did not take the Gulf settlement lightly. They were quite suspicious of it, and they were quite upset with it. They didn't like it. And so they continued protesting. They tried the best they could to get into the political parties and to cause change and to try and push their point. And so they came up with a number of different positions that they wanted, demands that they wanted. Some of them have been incorporated into the Southern issue. And there's this famous 20 points where the Southerners have 20 demands. And Hadi has addressed some of them. And there's two key ones, which were actually the beginning of the whole Southern movement. One of them was the dismissal of all of the military after 1994. In other words, the Southern military and the Southern employees, state employees, they were dismissed in privatization moves and simply punitive move against the Southern Army after the war. And the other is the issue of land in Yemen, in southern Yemen, which has always been an issue. It's a big issue. And he created these commissions that are going down that are supposed to solve all the problems related to those things. They have had, the Hadi government is even working even closer with Washington in the war on al-Qaeda. When Hadi was here at the Wilson Center, he was asked about the drones, and he said, they're more accurate than a dumb bomb, you know, let's use a smart bomb. I mean, full support. And there was a rapid reversal of al-Qaeda on the ground and the creation of the popular committees, the Lijan Shabiya. So those are the successes of the transitional government. And then the failures. The failures have been the security of infrastructure, the oil and gas. The oil pipeline seems to blow up almost daily. I mean, the oil pipeline, it's amazing. They just can't seem to get a hold of that. And the electrical system keeps getting knocked out as well, so the power is going out in the sun all the time. And then the other key thing is the transitional justice law. There was supposed to be a Salakar immunity under the Gulf Agreement, but there was supposed to be a law put into place to deal with all of the offenses, all of the crimes that happened during the revolution. That failed, that it did not go through. Okay, so in that context, here comes the Dialogue Committee, which is supposed to solve all the problems that haven't been solved already. And it begins March 18th. The composition of the delegates, there are 565 people that are there. 50% of them are Southerners. It doesn't mean that they are representing the southern portion of the country. It means that they are of southern origin. So, for example, the Islah Party, the political parties got representation. The Islah Party, which is basically a northern party, but it has strong roots in the south as well. Someone from the south is considered that 50%. So 50% of the people are of southern origin in them, although they're not representing the south, all of them. 30% are women, 20% are the youth. The political parties are represented. The largest bloc is with the ruling party. Women are represented. Again, outside of that 30%, there are women as a class are represented. Civil society is represented. There are 10 judges and 10 lawyers that are the rule makers that are there. And then the key ones are the Houthis in the southern movement. They are both there. The Houthis have put their list in. The Southerners have not put their list in. The president says that the southern representation is in his hands. He's going to put it together because the southern movement can't agree on who or what they're doing. Then there's two critical more points about the composition of the national dialogue. One of them is the role of Ali Abdullah Saleh. He still is the president of the ruling party, and there was great fear that he was going to show up at the national conference. And the opposition says absolutely not, that he can't show up and his son can't show up. And it appears that they're not going to. The Security Council, when they met in Yemen last week, was it last week? Help me out. I think it was last week they were there. The Security Council was there last week? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. When they were there, they afterwards made statements that it would be best if Saleh got out. And so the international community seems to be signaling that Saleh actually has to leave the country, which, Yemenis, a lot of Yemenis would support that. I don't think he's going to leave. But at least at this point, he's not going to be representing in the national dialogue, representing the ruling party. And then the other one is Zandani, who I don't know if he's on the list or not, but the American ambassador has said that he's not wanted there. And it seems he's being quite interventive and actually provocative there. So I don't know what's going to happen on that one. Okay, for the dialogue, the biggest problem right now is the problem of the Southerners. And what is the problem? The Southern, there is this thing called the Southern Movement, which includes many of the sort of political factions in the South, but it does not include many others. The South is very diverse and very divided politically. And within that context, there is a growing support for secession. When the Southern Movement first started, I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that that succession was being used as a political bargaining card to get a better deal out of Sana'a, and that most people would reject succession. And we saw in the referendum that there was after Hadi came to power, or before he came to power, there was a referendum on his rule. There was just one guy to vote for Hadi, and everybody went out to vote. In the South, there was heavy voting for him, even though the Iraq had called for people to boycott. They said, this is a northern affair, we have nothing to do with it. And so boycott it, still people went and voted. And people understood that, observers understood that as support for unity. But it does appear to be the case now, as time goes on, that there's more and more popular support for succession. And what you see now is Southern politicians of all stripes now are moving towards a secessionist stance. So time may be running out for unity in the South. What are the factions that are in the South? There's a local leadership that's on the ground, and then there's the old leadership, Ali Salam Abeid, Ali Nasser Mohammed, Atas, these guys. El-Baid is the guy who appears to be strongest in Lahij and Aden, and he's the guy that's strongest for succession. He's the guy that led the succession movement in 1994, the failed succession movement. And he's the one that is allegedly well connected with Iran and getting lots of support from Iran. Ali Nasser Mohammed and Atas are both suggesting federalism rather than succession. They have a substantial following as well. And then the new actor is, I don't know if I'm going to get his name right, but Muhammad Ahmed Ali, or Muhammad Ali Ahmed. He's the former governor of Abyan. He's a close associate of the president, and he, is a former socialist. He was key, I think, in sort of reconstituting Abyan after Al Qaeda left, and he is building Southern support for unity. He's working with the president. He held a conference of Southerners in which they recommended that they participate in the national dialogue. Al-Baid does not, will not participate, and his forces will not participate in the national dialogue. You have the Islah in the south. Islah was very strong. In the village that I lived right before the war, about a quarter of the village in Lahaj supported Islah. Islah does have, it's not only a northern party, it does have deep roots in the south. But what we're seeing is within Islah in the south, some of its leaders, particularly in the Hadramaut, have broken and left the party and starting to support southern succession now. And in the Hadramaut we had the Hadramaut in itself, the Hadrami business elite that are there, they absolutely refuse to have anything to do with any socialist again. They're not going to live under socialism. They're not going to live anybody who's tainted with socialism. So, and most of the Iraq, most of the Iraq, the core of the Iraq is former socialists. And they're very strong and very adamant that they're not going to have anything to do with them. And then you have former elites of the old Flossie, the people who were defeated by the NLF in the early days of the PDRY, and the Arabian Federation, so people like Al-Jifri, these guys coming back, or Tariq al-Fadli, or other southern elites that have come back in. And recently there was a move by the Saudis to, in effect, preempt the Iranian influence in the south by forming their own group. And it was a very interesting group of people because it was across the board. It was radical socialists to radical Islamists, all the way across the board, but all had connection to Saudi Arabia. They were people who had stayed in Saudi Arabia for a long time. Interestingly, Baum, who was one of the founders of the Iraq, he was there. Atas was there. So the Saudis there were trying to, of course, Al-Baid was not there, even though Al-Baid has been close to Saudi Arabia. Al-Baid was not there because he's getting money from the Saudis. So you see a proxy war going on within foreigners trying to create a southern leadership. The U.S. ambassador was in aid and trying to also pull together some kind of a group of representative southerners. I don't know what's going to happen with that. That is really up in the air. I have difficulty believing. I think that's going to be one of the failures. I have difficulty believing that there's going to be settlement in the South anytime soon. That there's going to be any kind of a legitimate representation. Their political differences are too big for the time being. And then the Gulf. The Gulf Agreement. The Gulf states refused to create, they were asked by the senators to create a Gulf agreement for the South specifically. The Gulf states refused to do that. And also the Security Council, they were asked to have a separate southern settlement, and they refused. They said, we're going to deal with Yemen on the basis of its national borders right now. One of the big problems I should point out if they go back to the old border is that the oil resources are mostly in the south, and that the gas resources, the gas LNG plant is in the south, but the gas comes from the north. So they're economically integrated, and so splitting it would be quite difficult to do, I'm sure. Then the Houthis in the north. The Houthis are in a completely different situation. They have a very unified leadership. They can speak, and they can speak authoritatively for what they will do. They have a very organized movement. But they also have complete sovereignty. They are a militarized group. They're governing themselves. And they agree to participate in the dialogue. But they are, to some extent receiving, and this is a big question, aid from the Iranians. And there is a proxy war going on with the Houthis. And the proxy war is between the Houthis themselves, any Iranian influence, and the Saudis. And the Saudis have they have their members in Islah, they have their supporters among certain tribes, they have their supporters among the Salafis, who are in armed conflict with the Houthis and fighting up in the north. So and here the big issue here is this recent arms shipments that I'm sure you've heard about. There was a ship that was intercepted by the United States, turned over to the Yemenis, and it's full of arms that are Chinese and Iranian manufacture. And the Yemeni government has protested and has asked the Security Council to come investigate. But as Robert Worth in the New York Times pointed out, the United States and Yemen have never been, have not been truthful in the past. They've not released the logs. They've not allowed the press to interview the crew. So this remains somewhat strange, this shipment of arms and where it was going to go. And I just hope that it's not a Gulf of Tonkin or an Iraqi WMD, in the sense that, you know, this is an opening of a serious war inside of Yemen. The U.S. ambassador has been quite provocative with them. He's been overstepping his bounds, and the Yemenis have been quite upset with him. He told the Houthis that either they come to the political dialogue or they fight with weapons, but they can't do both. This is silly. If you're the Houthis, the Yemeni government has been trying to kill you for the last, 10 years or whatever. There's no way you're going to put your weapons down. And the only way there's going to be political settlement is if the Houthis feel secure in this new Yemeni state. So them holding on to their weapons is perfectly rational from their side of the rule. Then the Islahi elites in the GPC. There's, what is the old elite going to do? Because basically the Gulf Agreement is an agreement of the old Yemeni elite, the Ali Muqsin faction that broke away, which was, he was the president's right-hand man, and the president and his family, the former president, and his family. There are a lot of Saleh supporters in Yemen still, and they are the core still of governance. How are they going to accommodate with the future? And right now, frankly, everybody is sitting and waiting to see what happens with the national dialogue and the elections. I think most people are sitting and waiting to see what's going to happen after the elections, and that will determine what people will do. But Saleh and his supporters will have an important role in Yemen's future. And the key question, I think, is is the accommodation with the Houthis and the Southerners and the role of the international community going to be enough force to change the rules of the game in Yemen, the rules of the political game? Is the old elite going to change? And that's the key thing. Because there has to be, I think, change in the rules of governance in Yemen and the way that Yemen is going towards further institutionalization in order to handle the challenges that are coming up. And these are, building an effective bureaucracy that's based on a legitimate political settlement that can address the issues of the economy, that can build an effective state that can tax, that has the legitimacy to tax, to raise revenues, to be able to create and create infrastructure for economic development. And the key thing is, to build investment, to get investment that will provide employment, because as we all know, there is a big youth bulge in Yemen, and growing the economy alone is not enough. You've got to create employment. Investment in the oil sector is great, but it doesn't create any employment. And the future of Yemen is in the employment of the youth. And you've got to have an effective state management of the economy to do so. And so all these things depend upon the degree to which the political rules in Yemen change. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you very much. Wait for the microphone, please. There we go.
Would you say a little bit more about the economy, how it stands and how it plays into this very complicated political situation?
How it plays into the complicated political situation is that right now they're not doing a whole lot. The Yemeni government's got too much on its hands with this national dialogue and the political issues that are coming up. And the international community is bailing them out. The Saudis are dumping money into the national treasury to keep the currency from collapsing. The Saudis have subsidized heavily. At one point they gave, $3 billion worth of crude oil to Yemen in the midst of the crisis in order that the country have fuel, people have fuel and whatnot, and they've repeatedly given money to the government. They want this government to survive, and so they're supporting it. Long-term change in the economy is going to depend on a political settlement, which is not going to happen for another year or two. The economic situation is stabilizing. Let's say it's barely hanging on, stabilizing. Of course, the year the protest was very bad. Everything came to a standstill. But there actually has been growth because the country has come back alive again.
Next. Back here. Would you wait for the microphone, please, and identify yourself?
Hi, Brett Schneider from POMED. Between political issues, a new constitution, preparing for elections, what's the minimum that you think needs to happen during the national dialogue for it to be termed a success?
Well, obviously they have to come up with a constitution and an election commission that can hold elections that are considered legitimate in enough of the population. I don't see it at this point. At this point, I don't see it happening in the South. But you know, as I said, people can change. We'll see what happens. It's still what, a month away? We're still a month away. And even afterwards, there's still time for the Southerners to be somehow incorporated in. But if they get enough of the northern part of the country, that would at least stabilize that part of the country. And I don't know what's going to happen with the Houthis.
Thank you. Dan Green, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how al-Qaeda has adapted to its new reality of having been repulsed and sort of the ongoing national dialogue. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, as soon as the Yemeni military was unified, and this had a lot to do with the president and his connections in Abiyan and putting together an effective fighting force, the al-Qaeda started retreating. They knew that they were outgunned and they were going to lose. And so they ran, and they went back to their terrorist attacks, and they were very successful for some time at assassinating a lot of high military people. They assassinated the guy who was in charge of the campaign against them in the south. And they killed a large number of soldiers in 70 Square in Sana'a as well. They appear to have killed the Saudi ambassador, or a Saudi diplomat inside of Sana'a. They're still holding a Saudi diplomat. They appear to have gotten 3 foreign tourists. So they appear to have gone back to sort of classic terrorism tactics. What I do find new is that there is in Yemen now, you find widespread condemnation of the U.S. drone campaign, but you also find in the same comments against the drones a condemnation of al-Qaeda. And I didn't see those quite the same before. Usually it was just, we don't like the drones. But now it's, we don't like the drones and we don't like al-Qaeda. And I think this, the Lijan Shabiya, the popular committees that came out, what I found interesting, the U.S. military folks, the West Point folks, they all said, oh, well, this is the Sahwa from Iraq. This was, the tribes turning against the al-Qaeda. In Yemen, it's not quite. And what's interesting is the name. The Lijan Shabiya, that's the Southern Sources. Those were the popular committees for defense that came from Cuba, right? That's Cuban-style popular military from the South. I just read an article yesterday, an interview with a sheikh from Marib, and he was talking about forming popular committees, which are not tribal in the sense that people are members of tribes, but these are just people who are coming together in defense, and they're defending their country, and they're being paid for. The ones in Abiyan were being put on the pay from the president. And I don't know if they're extending that program. But it is kind of a revolutionary thing. It's kind of a popular thing. It's not just tribal fighters. This seems to be effective and popular. So I would say that they're on the defensive, but they're going to be around. Terrorists, they're hard to root out.
Right here.
Hi, my name's Nate Grubman from the Journal of Democracy, and I'm wondering if these movements for secession in the South continue to gain steam, what sorts of things would have to happen for northern elites to see it in their interest to accept that peacefully?
Good question. there was a call. Sadiq al-Ahmar, the head of the Hashid Federation, at one point he said he would go to war against any southerner who argued for succession. And that comment was widely condemned both in the north and in the south on the basis that Yemen is not going to solve its problems through war anymore. There was also a fatwa that went out that said anyone who advocated succession was kafir, and that was also widely condemned. It's a good question. I think the problem is determining, creating a legitimate political leadership in the South. How do you do that? How do you do that? Do you hold an election in the South? Do you hold a separate election in the South? Who's going to supervise it? Who's going to put it together? Right now, there is no political structure in the South that could put elections together. But if something like that did happen, I think the northern elite would be forced to recognize it because of the idea that you don't solve your problems through war.
Thank you.
Ibrahim Al-Hajri, Search for Common Ground. My question is about, you mentioned the previous successes in dialogue processes and the Yemenis have used to deal with some of the issues. Looking at dialogue as a process for the national dialogue, do you see some successes or more failures? And if it's the latter, what would be a better option?
It has the possibility for success. I wouldn't be surprised if they do it, and then like in the Civil War, there were many of these. They kept going, and they acquired the names of the towns that they took place in Yemeni history. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened, because there are some really tough issues, the Southerners being one, and the second is the Houthis. Are the Houthis going to submit to a rule? I mean, I think with the Houthis, there's going to have to be, the Yemenis are going to have to think about alternative forms of state, in the sense that a centralized government, there's going to have to be decentralization and the recognition that the Houthis are going to control militarily there. Because if you're a Houthi, you're not going to give up your weapons after you have been attacked repeatedly over the last 10 years. But how to build a legitimate government with allowing alternative, how I said, multiple security forces within your country, if they could come to some kind of an agreement with this, I think it would be great. Actually, when the country split, when the Houthis gained their autonomy, and when the Southerners basically politically became autonomous, I thought it was a good thing for Yemen, because Yemen is a very diverse country, and one of its problems has been the rule has been centralized in the government, and this will force the Yemenis to institutionalize their diversity. They're going to have to talk, because the Southerners and the Houthis have the cards in this. They can agree or they cannot agree, and therefore they have to be dealt with. So in that sense, it's positive, but it's definitely, I think, going to take more time than they've got on their hands. So,
Jim, you mentioned just a moment.
Jim Platt, Cambridge Energy. You mentioned Iranian involvement in Yemen. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, of course, it's all quite unclear. But it is clear that the Iranians have invited large numbers of Yemeni of all stripes to come to Iran, and there have been the youth have gone, and they've had programs when they go to Tehran and whatnot, and they get trained. There have been accusations that they are training Houthi fighters, training Houthi activists. Ali Sami al-Bayt supposedly is getting funded from them. And there was an interview I saw up in Dalia, which is in the heart of the al-Bayt's territory up there in Lahij, and there was a guy carrying the sign of Ali Sami al-Bayt, and they said, "Why are you carrying the sign of Ali Sami al-Bayt?" "Because he pays me." Right. So, and he's got a television station, and he's broadcasting from Beirut, right? And it's having people watch it. People in the South watch it. So they do have influence. Just what I would say about that is what I'm worried about is an overreaction to that. I mean, what does it mean? I don't think it means that, I think what the fear is in Washington is that you're seeing Hezbollah. And the Houthis are not Hezbollah, they are a domestic group. They have domestic grievances, they have legitimate grievances. And, what are they going to do? Shoot missiles into Saudi Arabia? No, they're not interested in that. That's not what they're after. And they don't want to take over Yemen. The Houthis do not want to take over Yemen. They're clear about that. Even though the Iranians are there, I don't think that they have tremendous influence. I think they're being used by the Yemenis, various factions, and we need to be clear that we should deal with the Yemeni factions regardless of where they're getting their support.
Charles, I'd like to ask a question. What about the role of the president of Hadi? Because he was a southerner in origin. He helped fill that quota. He was a non-entity under Ali Abdullah Saleh. He was a reluctant president. He tried to get out of the job. And now he's been a surprise. He's shown leadership. Does he have a constituency? Can he provide the type of leadership that might give some coherence to the national dialogue?
That's a good question. I mean, I saw him at the Wilson Center. I don't know how many others you saw him there, and he looked like a befuddled old grandfather. I mean, he couldn't keep the glasses on his head, and he didn't seem to know what he was doing. And you go, wow, this is the president of Yemen. He has no constituency in the sense that he doesn't have Sanhan or he doesn't have Lahij. He is from Abyan, but his power in Abyan is only the extent to which the people are loyal to the current regime. It's not like he has his tribesmen that he's putting into. Some people have argued that some of his appointments in the military are coming from Abyan. He said, Abyan is replacing Sanhan. No, that's not what's happening. His power comes from the fact that he doesn't have a constituency, that Yemenis agree that he's not got an agenda, and the fact that the international community is behind him. That's where his power comes from. And that's a good thing. He actually, his personality of being a befuddled old grandfather is perfect for the role that he's playing. Yeah.
Yes, here, please.
Curtis Hudson, American Council on Education. I was wondering if I could get your take on the current state of higher ed in Yemen.
I just looked at a proposal for reform of higher ed or something like that. I don't know a lot about it. I do know that there are lots of very qualified people in higher ed in Sana'a. Yemeni intellectuals, Yemeni academics. I've met some excellent ones. But the problem with higher ed is the same with the problem of the rest of the institutions in Yemen, is that they were subjected to political criteria. And political criteria, how I put it, I should clarify that it's just your loyalty to the regime that counts. You can be any ideology that you want. You could be a socialist, a communist, or you can be a radical Al-Qaeda supporter. Doesn't matter. But as long as you're loyal to the regime and you show it, you're in. And that has a very corrupting effect. And so the institutions have broken down a lot. But I don't think that it would be difficult to rebuild those quite quickly, because there's lots of qualified Yemenis.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Frederica Mayer, Institute for State Effectiveness. To what extent do you think the humanitarian crisis, particularly water, which we keep hearing about, is going to have an impact on the national dialogue, or are the two just being kept separate?
It may come in. It comes in with the issue of cot. Some of the revolutionaries have tried to begin an anti-cot movement, and they had an abstain from cot day, a national abstain from cot day. That was actually fairly successful. And that's it's partially connected with water. It's also a social issue, but it's partially connected with water. It's not going to be a principal issue, but it is a pressing issue that requires state management. It requires regulation. That's what the water issue is. It's about regulating water. The Yemenis can deal with their water crisis. It's not an unsolvable problem. It's not a resource that is being completely depleted. It's being taxed. But it can be rebuilt on a sustainable form, but it's going to need effective governance. And so the larger question really is effective governance on that one.
Other questions? Yes, over here, please.
Hi, I'm Virginia Terhar. I'm from the State Department, and I just wanted to tack on to that question about the humanitarian situation. How much does the displacement factor into the dialogue with the protracted situation in the north and then the southern displacement, as well as food insecurity?
Yeah, I mean, the stats are quite high for malnourishment among children. There have been reports that have come out about the level of very high. They're talking like 50%, which is very, very high on a global standard. The displacement in the south, my understanding is that most people have gone back to their homes in Albion, and they're rebuilding, but it's a lack of infrastructure that people need help in rebuilding. And at this point, it's a self-service thing. That's where the Lijan Shabia, that's where the popular committees are coming in, because they're the ones that are providing security down there. But there needs to be some economic support for those folks down there, some credit, this kind of stuff, to help them rebuild. The ones in the north, it's a more difficult situation because it is a question of the political settlement with the Houthis. The Houthis, by the way, I should add, they have influence in all of Yemen. They have extended quite far beyond the military control, and they do have considerable support in the urban areas as well. So they are a political force to be reckoned with in the rest of the country. They're not just up in the north, but the refugee situation depends on what happens politically with them.
Yes, right here, please.
Hi, Andrew Self. I'm an intern here at MEI. I was wondering if you could talk about the competency of the military and possibly the efforts of the U.S. to improve internal defense.
The U.S. trains. The U.S. has one interest, and that's Al Qaeda, or Al Qaeda-like groups. And so the U.S. trains for state surveillance and anti-terrorism. And so, for a long time, the United States has been doing the Border Patrol, what's it called, the Coast Guard, and border surveillance, and then special teams to go after the counterterrorism forces. The United States is Yemen's kind of under a foreign mandate right now. And they divided up among the different countries the different tasks, like the French had constitution, I think, I'm not sure. But the U.S. had military reorganization. And the United States has helped in designing this program that Hadi has announced, which is to reorganize the military such the organization meets the security needs of Yemen. The military used to be highly politicized in the sense that it was not politicized, but it was divided up, such that the commanders had their own fiefdoms and they were all divided against one another, and so they couldn't unite together. This is to build a unified force under a single command that's designed to meet the security needs, and the United States had a big role in that as well.
Well, maybe please go ahead.
My name is Kamal Al-Mahdi. I'm sorry. I'm an independent. The question earlier you mentioned the Iranians are there to make trouble for the Saudis.
Mm-hmm.
So the Saudis, their involvement is a religious one or economic or just the south border?
It's just the border. The Saudis don't really consider Yemen to be a foreign country. They are the most, by far, the most influential actors inside of Yemen, foreign actors inside of Yemen. And they are very concerned about security. And the fact that the Houthis won. In the last round of the fighting, the Saudis threw their forces against the Houthis as well, and they lost. The Saudis are it's strange that the level of arms purchase they make, they're very afraid of using their armed forces because what if they lose? And in this case they did. So it's a real nightmare for the Saudis. And so they want to maintain, in one way or another, their influence in Yemen. That's what they're most concerned about. They don't really care who it is, seriously. They supported the Southern Socialists that had fought them for so long in the Civil War in 1994. They will support anyone as long as they are helping the Saudis maintain influence inside of Yemen.
Charles, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.